So good evening, everyone, both those of you here in the room and those of you who are joining us online, and welcome to the Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution. My name is Ian Gadd, and along with Betty Sushar sitting here, I co-convene the Literature and Humanities group here at the institution. Just some logistical points before I introduce tonight's speaker. So this is a hybrid event. So we have people both here and online. We will have microphones here for audience questions in the room, although we'll ask the speaker to repeat those questions for the benefit of people online. For those who are online, if they could give us their questions in the chat, that would be very grateful for that. In case there is a fire alarm, which would seem a crisis too far at the moment, but if there is one, we will head downstairs, leave by the main door, and then all turn right and convene around the corner in Chapel Row. You are not to cross the road. So that's the logistical housekeeping out of the way. Our speaker tonight is Geoffrey Marsh. From 2003 until this year, Geoffrey ran the Theatre and Performing Arts Department of the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, where he was best known for a series of highly successful exhibitions, including, I should have asked how to pronounce it, Diaghilev, and the Golden Age of the Ballets, 1909 to 1929. David Bowie is, and You Say You Want a Revolution, Records and Rebel, 1966 to 1970. He now works for AEA Consulting, which specialises in strategic planning for arts organisations around the world. Geoffrey's book, which you can see on the slide, Living with Shakespeare, was published by Edinburgh University Press in 2021, and his talk tonight draws directly on the research for that book. You can, we are pleased to say, purchase that book directly from the Edinburgh University Press's website with a 30% discount. Just use the code NEW3030. I will put that in the chat as well. So I want to add that one of the bonuses of being able to hold a talk like this at Queen Square is that we can draw on the institution's own collections. So I'm delighted to say that our curator, Matt Williams, has arranged for a book from our library to be on display over there. So apologies to those of you online who will not be able to see it in person. Edward Jordan's 1669 Discourse of Natural Baths and Mineral Waters, to which is added an appendix concerning Bath, as in the city, by Thomas Guido, a work that Geoffrey will be mentioning during his talk. And without any further ado, I will hand over to Geoffrey, who will be telling us about living with Shakespeare in the 1590s. Geoffrey, thanks very much.
So I have to look here for the camera. So if I'm ignoring you. Tonight I want to do three things. I want to talk a little bit about the area of London where Shakespeare lived in the 1590s. But much more interestingly, because people are really interested in human beings, I want to talk about the people who lived alongside him. It's often said that there's nothing more to be discovered about Shakespeare, but I think by looking at the society and the specific society that he chose to live with in the 1590s, there's some interesting things. And then in the final section, I want to talk a little bit about the connection with that group of people, with Bath, because there's some quite extraordinary connections. And at the end of it, I want you all to set you all off on a detective journey, because there's something that's gone missing over the years, and it hopefully is sitting in a house somewhere in Bath or in the vicinity. So let's see about that. So on the left there, you've got a map of London in the later 16th century. And the only point I really wanted to make was that it was still a medieval walled city. In most areas, the fields came up to virtually up to the city wall. And in the bottom right-hand corner, you've got the Tower of London, obviously defending London, but also a really nasty government interrogation centre. And then coming round at the bend of the river to the left, you've got Westminster with the Royal Palace and the courts and all the rest of it. Okay, so how did I get mixed up in this? Well, I think people get interested in Shakespeare in all sorts of ways. Some people get interested in school, but I'm afraid to say that I was certainly put off by studying Shakespeare at school, but like a lot of people. But we've obviously had a whole series of films about Shakespeare, and Matthew O'Farrell brought out Hamlet last year, which has been a huge success, and I don't know if any of you have read it, but it's been extraordinarily popular. The thing that really got me interested in doing this bit of work, though, was that in 2008, top right-hand corner, the remains of the theatre were discovered in Shoreditch, or a section of it, the foundations. This was the theatre built by Burbage and where Shakespeare worked and performed in the 1590s. It's probably where Romeo and Juliet, The Merchant of Venice, A Midsummer's Night Dream, and all those plays were premiered. And this section was found when a building was knocked down, and a very generous person has given the site to a trust, and at some point in the future, post-COVID, it will be opened up. So you'll be able to visit it and stand, hopefully, on the site where those great plays were first performed. And here in the bottom right is a sketch of that period, and the theatre, built in 1576, is circled in red, and the curtain, which was alongside it was a bit like having two football grounds next to each other. There must have been a bit of noise leakage, is circled on the right. And they're shown as theatres because they've got the flag flying over them. So this manuscript on the left is deliberately opaque. And the reason I wanted to do that was because, in a sense, it reflects what's happened about this document, which demonstrates that Shakespeare lived in a parish in London. It's what's known as a lay subsidy roll. It's a tax document. It was also a wealth tax. And although it was discovered in the 1840s in the National Archives, I don't think anybody has really examined it apart from to point out that Shakespeare's name on it. Before we go into the bit of detail, I just want to set the scene here. So England in the 1590s, Queen Elizabeth was the ruler, but she was no longer the young lady of her first part of her reign. She was 60 in 1593. And she'd been queen since 1558. So you had to be over 40 to remember anything earlier than her. So for most people in England, it's a bit like nowadays. The Queen had sort of always been there. Hugely complicated political situation. I won't go into a great deal of detail, but the Spanish Netherlands, that's the area which is now northern Belgium and Holland, was occupied by the Spanish, and in a sort of quasi-civil war had broken out. As particularly the Protestants, particularly the Dutch Protestants, tried to force their Spanish masters out, and the war went backwards and forwards across the area for decades, but most notably with the sacking of Antwerp, which was the richest city in Northern Europe in 1576, the year the theatre was built, and with thousands of refugees coming to England, but also going into Germany as well. And many of those French and Dutch-speaking refugees settled in the area that we're going to look at. And in fact, to this day, if you know the city of London, the Dutch church is still there, a few minutes walk from the parish of St Helens that we're going to look at. And it was the famous Dutch church libel in May 1593, a poster stuck up on the wall of the church threatening to murder the immigrants, which, as some of you may know, led to the events which led to Christopher Marlowe's arrest and probable murder. And there's Shakespeare. So this is the famous drawing we have of him done after his death. At the time we're talking about, he was 30. The first reference to him since his children were born was in 1592 as the upstart crow. And in 1593, shades of what we're living through at the moment, there was a massive plague outbreak in London. In the parish we're going to look at, 10% of the population died. Okay, so where is this parish? So the parish we're looking at is St Helens. So that's the dark brown one here, number 64. For those of you who know your city of London, this is Liverpool Street Station, and where the red star is up at the top, that's the site of the theatre. So that's Shakespeare's workplace. So he was living just inside the city wall, inside Bishopsgate, and it's there that he's recorded as a taxpayer in 1597 and 1598. So what's a lay subsidy roll? Well, that is a lay subsidy roll. I don't know if any of you have ever dealt with these things. but they're very long and they're rolled up, which makes them pretty perfect as homes for rodents and other nasty things, and also almost perfect as firelighters. So although hundreds and hundreds of these would have been produced over the years, a relatively small number of them survived. It was finances of Queen Elizabeth were pretty hand to mouth. What money came in went straight out again on all her expenses. And so the economy wasn't really big enough to support certainly major wars. So in the 1590s, there was a major war in Ireland. And so there were a whole series of these special taxes going out. And what they involved was each parish and then each ward would list all the people, the wealthier residents, and they'd be taxed. So this is the relevant document. And on the left-hand side, I don't know if you can see it, under with the blue line underneath it, it says William Shakespeare, and he's valued at £5. Now, these valuations in the middle, they didn't have the time to go around and literally, you didn't have to fill in a form saying how much you earned. It was really people going around and saying, well, he's sort of that level and he's at the next level and so forth. Just coming to, on the right-hand side, you can see William Shakespeare, £5 there. And written against his name, it says Affid. I don't know if you can see that there. Affid, which meant he didn't pay it. And so the tax collectors, when they knocked on his door on the 1st of October, 1598, they were responsible for that payment unless they could make a declaration that they hadn't been able to collect it. And it's often said that Shakespeare was a tax avoider, but it's probably slightly more complicated than that. Coming down to the red line, there's someone there called Edward Jorden, who we're going to come on to later. It should say he's a doctor. It doesn't say he's a doctor, but he was. And Edward Jorden played a key role in the history of Bath, which we'll come to later as well. So there's some very interesting people mixed up. So this list of names of the people that paid their taxes, and just moving into slightly more detail, up at the top here, under the two red lines there, they're quite difficult to read, but there's Dr. Taylor, and underneath here, Dr. Turner. And just to show you the extraordinary things that are in your institution, I didn't know it was here. Your curator turned up this afternoon with the commonplace book you have in your collection of Dr. Peter Turner's father, William Turner, you have in your collection, which I've never seen, and is quite absolutely extraordinary. We'll perhaps come on to that in a minute. And then right at the top, at the first line, is John Spencer, Sir John Spencer. John Spencer was a sort of pantomime villain of the piece. He was an extremely unpleasant man, but he was one of the richest people in London, and we'll come on to him as well in a minute because he was Lord Mayor. So in this parish, there were 40 English families paying the tax, 15 stranger families, that's immigrants, either Dutch or French, or maybe one or two Italians. And then there were probably around 60 families below the tax limit. So in this parish, there were probably 100, 120, maybe families. And Shakespeare, was, as I said, was assessed at £5. And just to put that in context, the two successful, one of them at least was a society doctor who treated Walter Raleigh and people like that. They were put at £10, which gives you some idea. This is, Shakespeare was recognised as sort of certainly moderately wealthy by this time. He was in the top quarter of what was a pretty rich parish. So what was this parish? Well, this is what it looked like just before the dissolution. It was actually a nunnery. Here's the nunnery. The church is there. That's the nuns' dormitory. That's their dining room. And these were their gardens. So almost half the parish was a nunnery. And to put it in sort of context, what life was like, that was Bishopsgate coming in here. And then down all the way along here, there were a series of very large inns, the Bull, the Green Dragon, the Three Swans, and the Vine. And the Bull, which was the one literally just there, actually had a theatre in it until 1594. So if one's wondering why Shakespeare might have moved to here, he was not only quite close to the theatre, but there was literally a theatre on the other side of the road. But the other thing to say is that at the dissolution, the nunnery was bought by the society, the Guild of Leather Sellers, and who they still own it today. So they bought 3 acres of prime city property in 1543, and they still own that property to this day. And they have a remarkable set of archives, which is sort of what my books are around. And the reason that they bought it was they took over the nuns' dormitory and they turned it into their livery hall. That's where they had all their dinners and all the rest of it. But there were some pretty interesting people around here. So the north wing of the nunnery became a sort of upmarket house, and it was occupied at this time by someone called John Robinson. He was an alderman, one of the leaders of the city government. He had 16 children, as we'll see in a minute, and he was extremely, he was irascible, I think would probably be the word. And then the bull in here, and although I couldn't identify it exactly, it's highly likely that Shakespeare's lodgings were in this place. I say lodgings because we know in 1602 that he actually was in a lodging in another house in the city of London. People sort of imagine that our national poet had a sort of big house and was living in it. On the contrary, he was actually, certainly in 1602, living in the house of a French immigrant, another irascible character called Mr. Mountjoy, and probably just had a couple of rooms on the floor. And then some of the other people that were living around him, this is Crosby Hall, one of the great medieval houses of London. Amazingly enough, if you're ever in London, it still survives. Not on this site, it was dismantled stone by stone and moved to Chelsea in 1912. And it's a magnificent late medieval hall. John Spencer, who was a super rich, self-made man, you can think of a few analogies nowadays. He was known as Rich because he was so rich. When he became Lord Mayor, he bought the house as a sort of fantastic backdrop to being mayor. And one of the reasons I think Shakespeare probably moved into the parish before then is I think it's highly unlikely that he'd have moved in after Spencer moved in, because Sir John Spencer hated theatre and did everything he could to close it down. And then I mentioned a couple of these doctors. So here is in the west wing of the former nunnery is someone called Dr. Peter Turner, who we'll come on to in a minute. And down here is probably the house of Dr. Edward Jorden. You can't tell exactly where it was, but it was probably someone in that area. So in the 1590s, there were 3 doctors in one parish, which is very unusual because there are only something like 17 or 18 doctors in the whole of the city, and there were 100 parishes. So to have 3 of them in one parish was very unusual. And we'll come on to that again in a minute. So this is a sort of place that Shakespeare was living, probably in a building that had been carved out of the remains of the nunnery. The Leather Cellars basically rented these properties out, and those rental records survive in their archives. So we know exactly when people moved in and out, like John Robinson. Alas, Shakespeare's name doesn't actually appear, which suggests that he was probably a subtenant. So the Leather Cellars were only interested in who was paying them the rent. So he was probably taking lodgings someone in that area. This is a map of London after the Great Fire, and there's this funny, everybody thinks the city was completely destroyed, but there's a funny little strip of land over here on the east side which survived, and the parish is in that circle. So the interesting thing is, if you ever go up to London and got nothing better to do, you can actually go and see Shakespeare's Parish Church. It's not really marketed as such, which is bizarre really when you think of Holy Trinity in Stratford-on-Avon, which maybe you've been to. But this is pretty much the view that Shakespeare would have had. This brick building here, which is still owned by the Leather Cellars, is the southern end of the west wing of the nunnery, and Shakespeare's lodgings were probably just about over here. And the interesting thing you'll notice is there were actually, the church is divided in half. This was the nuns' church, and this was the parish church, and there was a partition down the middle. This bit here, the turrets, much more recent. So that's pretty much the view that Shakespeare would have had, with this tiny churchyard in front, And in the plague of 1593, 60 people were buried in that space, which gives you some idea of the pressure on land. And just to say, in case you recognise it, this is the Gherkin, which was built on the site of the Baltic Exchange, which was destroyed by an IRA bomb in 1992-93. And it was that explosion which very badly damaged the church, but fortunately didn't destroy it completely. So that's what it looks like inside. So after the nunnery disappeared, the church was thrown into one space, and it's likely that the right-hand side had pews from the records, there's records of them being repaired. But this area over here was probably just sort of benches. There was certainly a degree of gender separation. There's references to male and female pew benches. And you can first see at the back here, these are actually the nuns' choir seats, which just got left there. And certainly in the 18th century, that's where the poor people sat. It seems a bit odd to us sitting in these kind of magnificent seats. But of course, at that time, it was being close to the vicar, the minister, that counted. And although this is a complete supposition, it is rather curious thinking of Shakespeare, who must have been so used as a playwright to controlling an audience, that in church he was just another parishioner under the eye of the minister, the clerk, but also the church wardens who sat at the back to make sure that everybody was paying attention. And this is complete fantasy, but I do like rather to imagine him sitting on a bench here behind one of these columns so that the minister couldn't see him and he could get on with his work. But that's complete imagination on my part. It's interesting, of course, it was the Leather Cellars because, as you may know, Shakespeare's father was a glover. And the glovers in London, although at certain times they had their own guild, in the 1590s were part of the Leather Cellars. And so there's a magnificent late 16th century glove, one in the V&A, and there's Elizabeth holding one in her hand or holding a pair. Of course, a lot of these gloves were so elaborate and so expensive, you'd never actually worn them. They were like kind of handbags nowadays. They were kind of showing off your status and wealth. So it's interesting that Shakespeare seems to have moved into an area where, on the one hand, you've got these Leather Cellars, people possibly connected even back to his father in Stratford, and then the Bull Theatre on the other side of the road. So it seems quite a good explanation why he settled there. But it was also a very upmarket, wealthy parish, and this was the time when Shakespeare was really trying to restore his family fortune. His father, he thought, had gone bankrupt. There's not a lot of arguments over this, but it was at this time that Shakespeare, first of all, got a heraldic sign for the family, and also he bought the second largest house in Stratford. So he was clearly making money and wanted to sort of re-establish the reputation of his family. The interesting thing about the church, if you go into it, is that actually there's quite a few memorials from Shakespeare's time that are still in there. Records we know about 30 or 35, most of which have disappeared. But there's about 5 or 6 which still survive. This is Sir Andrew Judd here with his family around him, very typical of the time. He was Lord Mayor in 1550, and he was an international trader. And it's actually recorded that he traded with Guinea. Guinea then meant just the west coast of Africa. It didn't mean Guinea, the country. Probably not involved in the slave trade. It's probably earlier than the start of the slave trade, and probably initially going there for ivory and gold. But that's certainly something that there's a good chance that Shakespeare would have seen. And in fact, these memorials must have been a sort of history of English sort of history in 3D. So that's the kind of map of where we've been talking about. So this is Helens, the Bull Theatre, and this is 20-minute walk. So this is the theatre where the Lord Chamberlain's men were based, and Curtain. But it's also almost equidistant with the Rose, where the Lord Admiral's men were, and probably for Shakespeare, another crucial area, the booksellers who were concentrated around St Paul's Cathedral and the churchyard. So in terms of a choice of place to live in London, it was very convenient. There were 2 more inns here with theatres in them. It's often said that he lived here because it was near the theatre, but it's a 20-minute walk. So you can imagine what it would have been like in the rain with the roads in a bit of a state and just with a woolen cloak. So he decided not to live next door to the shop, so to speak. The Burbages, who owned the theatre, lived here, and Christopher Marlowe lived just about there. But Shakespeare was tucked up nicely in his rather wealthy parish. So that's his walk to work in the morning. He'd come out of St Helens, out through Bishopsgate, and a couple of interesting sites along the way. This is a map from the 1560s. By the time he was there, it was probably a lot more built up. Even so, most of it would have been fields. This is more fields here. You can see people drying clothes, people practicing shooting and archery here. There are a couple of windmills. It's all pretty rural. But interesting enough here is the Bedlam Hospital, which was the only place where people with mental illness were housed. It was very small at this time. It probably had no more than 30, a little bit more residents. A lot of people just went there, they've had like nervous breakdowns or the equivalent. So although people were chained up there, other people who lived there could sort of just wander around. So it's interesting, obviously, when you think of things like King Lear, about Shakespeare's idea of madness and all that, but for several years, maybe 5 or 6, he was walking past the Bedlam Hospital every day on his commute to work. And then, interestingly enough, here, the Green Star is what's called Norton Falgate, which is where Christopher Marlowe lived until his murder or death in 1593, which is also an ex-monastic precinct. It's very interesting, these two great playwrights, these two great almost rivals, were living in the remains of monastic sites which have been sold off to rich owners, and the buildings converted into rather upmarket residences. If you look at books about Marlowe, it's always written that Norton Falgate was a very sort of louche area, and it was an independent liberty. It wasn't controlled by the city corporation and the mayor, because it was on the boundary between the city and the county of Middlesex. However, at the time, it would have been a pretty upmarket place. It had a big house owned by a wealthy family, and it's curious that the two of them are in very similar types of accommodation, probably. We talked a little bit about plague earlier on. This shows you, I hope this is not what we're going to have in this country, every 10 years, COVID reappearing. But you can see here that the pattern of outbreaks of plague. This is just in the parish of St Helens, so 1563, 1578, 1593 is probably the time that Shakespeare, and then the terrible plague in 1603, which in St Helens killed 20% of the population. And then obviously off to the right is the Great Plague of 1665. But it's probable that certainly Londoners have built up some degree of protection against plague. And one of the curious things, although this has been known since the 1950s, is that the parishes had radically different patterns of plague, even in the same periods, and because the deaths were recorded by parish, which were often tiny, just a few streets, I think there's some fascinating work to be done about the reasons behind why the plague spread in some parishes, but not in others. It was clearly due partly to wealth and people simply getting up and leaving London, but I think underneath it there were more complex reasons. And there's the famous engraving, a woodcut of plague, later plague, with a woman down there who's got the plague buboes on her chest, the red swellings, and saying "we die," and then they're flying, and all these people here saying "keep out." I'm sure you can see the modern parallels. So the plague happened, and then, interesting enough, the next year, this guy John Spencer turned up, and as I said, he was super rich, huge money lender, which gave him enormous influence. He was one of the great international traders of London who founded the East India Company on the 31st of December 1600, right at the end of the 16th century. And he acquired Crosby Hall, really, I think, just to sort of show off in this huge medieval hall house. He was very unpopular, and when he died, he left no money to charity, which is virtually unheard of. And he was very anti-theatre. He only had one child, Elizabeth, who was disobedient or feisty, depending on how you look at disobedient daughters, and she was called Elizabeth, and she refused to marry who he wanted her to. It's recorded that he abused her. It doesn't actually define what that actually means, but he was actually put in the Fleet prison for a while because she wanted to marry the dashing Lord Compton. Lord Compton was a courtier. He was a sort of man about town, and he fought each year in the Accession Day tilts. This was the thing to celebrate Queen Elizabeth. And in the V&A, there's a fantastic drawing of his armour, magnificent suits of armour. So she obviously had her head turned by Mr. Compton. I think Sir John Spencer, who spent his entire life building up his enormous fortune, could see it disappearing very quickly. So he refused to allow her to marry him, but she just ignored him in the end and married him anyway, not in St. Helens, another parish. If you want to know what happened, you'll have to read my book. But this is their tomb. It's still in the church. It's been moved, and it's often said that she's got her back to her parents because she didn't get on with them. It's possibly true, but I think it may have been because she's also looking at the communion table. But she was clearly a very clear-thinking young woman who got what she wanted. Now, it's interesting because she wasn't the only feisty young Elizabeth in the parish. There was another one. As I've mentioned, north of where Shakespeare was Alderman John Robinson. And this is his funerary monument, which is still in the church, and he's got his 16 children. He was a tough wool merchant, real hard-nosed businessman. It's mentioned in the book. When he was, just before he died, he was his oldest son was suing him, and he told his other children to go and remove his will from his counting house, so they couldn't get it. His eldest son couldn't get his hands on it. But one of the curious things about this, I don't know if any of you know who Simon Foreman was, but he was an astrologer in the city whose records extraordinarily survive in the Bodleian in Oxford. John Robinson, alderman, pillar of the establishment, was having his fortune told in horoscopes, which is kind of not quite what you imagine. But the interesting thing is, his youngest daughter, Elizabeth, here, so there were two Elizabeths, one on either side of Shakespeare lodging, was also very disobedient, and she was struck out of his will in 1600. I'm just going to read you what it says. He wrote the will in 1599, just before he died. And it says, "My daughter Elizabeth Robinson, who is of wilful mind, contrary as well to her duty as to the customs of the honourable city of London, hath bestowed herself in marriage without my consent and agreement. Therefore my mind is, in regard of her disobedience, she shall enjoy neither part nor portion of any part of my goods. Only in remembrance of her love towards her, I give her £10. Now, to put it in context, he left somewhere between £20,000 and £25,000. So I think the £10 is probably a sort of sarcastic thing. He was a very irascible character. But the interesting thing is, Elizabeth had married the deeply unsatisfactory Thomas Jeffreys on the 23rd of September 1596 at a church a few hundred yards away. It's interesting that it's almost certain that was just around the time that Shakespeare was writing A Midsummer's Night Dream. And those of you who know the play, it starts off with Aegeus coming in and speaking to Theseus, king of Athens. And Theseus says, well, what's the problem? And he says, my daughter won't marry the person that I want to, and that's how it's set off. Now, I'm not going to mention any more connections between the people who lived around Shakespeare and Shakespeare's writing. If you're interested in any of them, there are a few in the book, but I must make it clear, there's absolutely no evidence that Shakespeare ever spoke to any of his neighbours about anything. Whether you think it's likely or not is another question. And I'm just going to read you a little bit from A Midsummer's Night Dream, because the interesting thing is that Theseus states Aegeus' daughter's fate if she doesn't obey him, either to die the death or to abjure forever the society of men. If you yield not to your father's choice, you can endure the livery of a nun, for I to be in shady cloister nude. And it's interesting that Elizabeth was actually living in the north wing of a nunnery, looking out over the cloister. But obviously, whether there's any connection or not directly is up to you to decide. And there's a few other people, and perhaps most interesting in terms of what access Shakespeare might have had to books is Jon Snow, the great historian of London, whose survey of London was published in 1598, lived literally 2 minutes or 2 or 3 minutes walk away in the next parish. And it's often been commented on the great similarity between their two funeral memorials. That's Jon Snow on the left in St Andrew's Church. You can still see that in the City of London. And there's Shakespeare heavily restored on the right in Holy Trinity in Stratford. And the interesting thing is they both have real cool pen. They're both designed so they could hold a real cool pen in their hands. Okay, I'm just conscious time is flying on. So the next bit I wanted to do was just talk about medicine and these doctors, because they provide quite an interesting link to Bath. So in the west wing of the nunnery was Dr. Peter Turner, who was a society doctor, and he was what was called a Paracelsian. And he lived within 50 or 60 feet of where Shakespeare probably lived. Now, the interesting thing is he was the son of William Turner, who was a Marian exile, who wrote the first books in English, and I think this is extraordinary, on plants, spas, wine, and bird spotting. And I only found out, as I said earlier on this afternoon, that you had his, 2 volumes of, one's a commonplace book of bits he copied out of various people. But the extraordinary thing is you've actually got his doctor's medicine book, most of which is in Latin, and as far as we can see, it's never been published. Absolutely extraordinary thing that you've got here. I mean, it's amazing. I'm particularly amazing to turn up and find it sitting here. Someone wrote a PhD on it in 1963, but I don't think anybody's looked at it much since then. So William Turner was a medical doctor, but he was also a religious figure, and he was the Dean of Wells. And he was very, very highly educated, and almost certainly had a very extensive library, which probably passed to Peter Turner because he was his only son. Dr. Peter Turner was taken as a child to Germany. He grew up in Germany. He practiced in Germany. And one of these interesting things is when you read about how on earth did Shakespeare know anything about anywhere across the Channel, you can see that in this parish he was living alongside people who had wide experience of Europe and knew some of the most famous, certainly medical people there. So I've described him as a Paracelsian. Can I just ask, how many of you know what Paracelsian is? Is anybody? Okay, right, because it's rather crucial. This is Paracelsus. He was a Swiss doctor who had a rather extraordinary name, and he called himself Paracelsus because Celsus was a famous Roman classical doctor. So he basically was saying, I'm as good as classicists. And the key thing about, there's entire books written about Paracelsus. He's a very complicated figure. But up until this time, doctors were still working on the ideas, the classical ideas of Galen, that you had these 4 humours in your body and had to try and keep them balanced, rather like some sort of alternative therapies nowadays. That was what it was felt about. Paracelsus, who actually did an enormous amount of work with miners in Switzerland and in the Alps, diseases that they had in the mines, was really promoted, really for the first time, the idea of using chemical medicines, what we would call medicines nowadays, but they were called chemicals in those days, including laudanum, which he christened laudanum, meaning to praise, because it had such an extraordinary effect. And the interesting thing is that his work was first mentioned in an English publication by William Turner, the father of Dr. Peter Turner. Although these ideas really only spread into England in the late 16th century. And for any of those who studied the history of your spa here, William Turner actually wrote about the spa here in the 1560s, basically saying that it was a mess and ought to be improved and all the rest of it. And I think he was the person actually suggested that the horse spa ought to be put in so that you could put horses in the spa here to cure them. So that was the sort of developing medicines, and yet at the same time, you have this fervent belief in astrology. This is a page from Dr. Foreman's, Simon Foreman's manuscript in the Bodleian, and this is an example which is I've just put in because it actually says up here. It says this is a 16-year-old Christine Naylor who went to visit Foreman to have her fortune cast, and this is his record. These are of the papers as he folded up the astrological casting, and she claimed she'd been bewitched. And I don't quite see here, but it says Goodwife Kirk here, and she says she's been bewitched. And as a result of this, Anne Kirk was arrested and hung as a witch. Fortman also cast famously for Amelia Lanier, Britain's first female poet, for Shakespeare's later landlady, and as I've mentioned, Alderman John Robinson, his neighbour in the 1590s. And interesting enough, one of John Robinson's daughter married someone called Sir Robert Napier, and Sir Robert Napier's brother was a friend of Forman's and inherited all these books, and it was him that gave them to the Bodleian. So there's a very sort of close connection between all this sort of stuff. So on the one hand, you've got these kind of radical doctors who are promoting new types of medicine and the fact you can alter people's health with chemicals, alongside casting astrology mixed up in this extraordinarily complex society. And this is just to show that there were actually several people connected with Bath in the area. This house, which was actually the next parish on Bishopsgate Street, almost certainly was occupied by John Whalley, senior, and later by his son, another John Whalley, who's alderman of Bath, and died in 1593. I wonder possibly of the plague. So coming down, we've got the Bull, where Shakespeare would have lived, and then you've got Peter Turner, and interestingly enough, sorry, the thing's slightly slipped. Here in 1617 was the house of Patrick Saunders. Patrick Saunders came from Weston in Bath, just up the road here. He was astonishingly talented, and he came to London to work for the great wizard, Dr. John Dee, absolutely extraordinary figure, had the vast library. And he worked with Dee until Dee died, and he certainly inherited part of his library. Dee's library is scattered now all across Europe. There's a big project to try and reconstruct it, but quite a lot of the books, and indeed some of his original manuscripts, have Patrick Saunders' name written on inside them. And then down here we've got Dr. Edward Jorden, who was one of the big promoters of Bath as a spa at the time. So who was Jorden? Well, Edward Jorden trained at the University of Padua in North Italy. Everybody says, how does Shakespeare know anything about North Italy? Well, it's kind of interesting that Jorden trained at Padua, which was then the University of Venice, because Venice had a large land-based empire at the time, and there was no university in Venice itself. So the University of Padua, one of the oldest universities in the world, and it was the leading medical university of Europe. Some of you may have been there and seen the extraordinary anatomy theatre, which still survives. So he moved into St Helens in 1595. His wife was pregnant with twins. Tragically, they died. They died at birth, which was obviously, the twins were highly risky. And it's kind of interesting because obviously Shakespeare had twins himself. And as I said, there were these 3 doctors in the parish. And he defended, which was quite extraordinary, the witch Elizabeth Jackson in a very, very famous bewitchment case called the Mary Glover affair. There's not time to talk about it in detail, but there's lots of, if you're interested, there's lots of stuff on it on the internet if you just put in Mary Glover. And the interesting thing is that Mary Glover, who was a teenage girl, accused Elizabeth Jackson of bewitching her, and the minister of St Helens Church went to court to on Mary Glover's side, and Edward Jorden defended person who was accused of witchcraft. It's a very, very extraordinary thing to actually go to court on the other side from your minister. There was great drama, and I won't go into it in great detail, but the minister, Lewis Hughes, was actually thrown out of the parish as a result, and then disappears from the history books until only to reappear in 1614 as the first minister in Bermuda, but that's another story entirely. In 1603, though, just after this, Dr. Edward Jorden brought out this book called A Brief Discourse of a Disease Called the Suffocation of the Mother. And this is arguably the first book in English on female well-being. I mean, you could argue that, you know, exactly, but the purposes of tonight, I think it's a reasonable description. Up until this time, doctors' understanding of the female body was pretty basic, and as some of you may know, doctors believed that the uterus actually moved around inside the body of women and put pressure on different organs, which accounted for why women were like they were. And to the extent that, and this is why the mother actually was what they called the uterus, they believed that it could move up and actually throttle a woman by putting pressure on the throat. Now, this book, if you want to read this, is actually online. It takes a bit of finding, but you don't have to go to a specialist library. You can just find it online, and it's an extraordinary book. It's because Jorden, and this was how he tried to defend Jackson, really said, he said, if people can do special effects as an actor, they can throw their voices and all the rest of it, isn't it just possible that these teenage girls have got this is psychosomatic symptoms they're showing? And Mary Glover, her body swelled up. It's described that her body swelled in all sorts of places and all sorts. It's all described if you follow the story. And so what Jorden was really wrestling with was really what I suppose now was we call the impact of mental control over your body. And he was really on the sort of, front line on this. He lost the case, actually. The judge actually said, I've hung loads of witches, I know what they're like, and she's a witch, and you're talking rubbish, basically. Sure. So it wasn't so good for Elizabeth Jackson. But he brought out this book as a result, the year after the trial. Now, by this time, it is possible that Shakespeare left the parish. So, but he would certainly, this was a sort of cause célèbre in the city, because Mary Glover was related to some of the most powerful people in the city. So her case is very well documented. This is not a case of witches dancing around on some moorland in the north of England and all that sort of thing. This is something happening in the heart of the capital. And Jorden actually, after that, was asked to by James I to investigate Anne Gunter, which was another one of these bewitchment things, and he demonstrated she was a fraud. So, what's the connection with Bath? This is just a bit from this book that's on the left that you have in your collection. So, Jorden published this book in 1631, just before he died. He died in 1633 and was buried in the abbey. He had a somewhat mixed experiences in Bath. His daughter married the mayor, but tragically one of his sons actually drowned in the King's Bath. But he seems to have settled here eventually. And as you can see, the book was reprinted, which is this edition, in 1669, by Thomas Guido, and it says at the top, than by his picture, which I'll come back to in a minute, very important. But it says here, the universities beyond the sea is where he trained, especially at Padua, where he got his degree in physics, and returned home and became an eminently solid and rational philosopher. And he looked after Anne of Denmark, James I's wife, when she came here. So he obviously was highly respected person. Now, that's the book that's the real one. You've actually got a copy of it. And what's fascinating about this, if you look into it, this is also on the internet if you want to read it, is that what Jorden realised is that by taking spa waters particularly North Italy where he studied, where you could see you could actually record the impact of different spa waters on patients. You could then distill that water, and you find from the residue, you could actually work out what was in it. So this is really the first time when doctors could show cause and effect between chemicals. Up to that time, it was pretty much guesswork. And so this is what this this book is really about. So it's an extraordinary sort of step forward in sort of medical history, and it's a fascinating connection between these neighbours who were living around Shakespeare in the 1590s in London and the development of your town as a major medical centre. So I've got a challenge for you, because when brought out his new edition, he put a series of terrible poems in the front. Unfortunately, we can't get all the pages, but you can look it up online if you want to. One of them, as you can see here, in 1669, is on the site of Dr. Jorden's picture, and it says, "Thrice happy painter." So it's clear that at this time there was a painting of Edward Jorden in Bath, in the home of who became another major promoter of Bath in the late 17th century. So the challenge I'm setting you all, and so this is to everybody online and people here, is this painting still survive somewhere? Has it lost its label and sitting in someone's home, maybe in Bath, maybe in a house in the surrounding area, is painted this extraordinary character and connection between Shakespeare and this city, and it's lost the label, or maybe no one recognises what it is. So there's a little task for you over the next year or two. And I did go around the galleries today in Bath. I thought it'd be really embarrassing if I said this and suddenly sitting on the wall somewhere, but I haven't been able to find it so far. And so what might it look like? And on the left, this is a slightly... The interesting thing about Jorden, he was born in 1564, the same year as Shakespeare. If you look on Wikipedia, it says it was 1569, but it's actually wrong. He was born in 1564, so he's exactly the same age as Shakespeare. And even if Shakespeare didn't talk to the older doctors, these two older doctors who were in the parish, I rather like to think he might have talked to someone who's exactly the same age as he was. So there's William Gilbert there, so a little bit earlier, or obviously William Harvey, a little bit later. So somewhere between those sort of looks is what this painting presumably looked like of Jorden. There are great experts sitting here of English literature, so I won't push this too far. But one of the other poems here, this is from the start of the book, I've got really terrible puns. So of course, Jorden's name obviously allowed them to riff off the River Jordan in the Bible. So here you've got, "In Jordan's streams which out of Bath do rise, they'll clear thy sight and make thee clearly see." So it gives you some idea of the quality of local poetry writing in the 1660s. But clearly he had quite a strong, powerful reputation still surviving at the time. And on the right, there's another poem in Latin, which I don't have time to go to. I'm conscious time just running out, so I'm just going to finish. So how did all this end? Well, the first thing was the theatre, the one that Shakespeare worked in, Shoreditch, was on leased ground. The landlord didn't like having the theatre there. He decided after 21 years. So in 1597, which was 21 years after it was built, he refused to renew the lease. And some of you may know the story. It's beautifully told in Jim Shapiro's book, 1599. Just after Christmas Day, a couple of days after Christmas, in 1598, a gang of people, might have involved Shakespeare, maybe not, led by Peter Street, the carpenter who built the Globe, descended on the theatre and dismantled it and took it away, stole it, while the landlord was out at Christmas in Essex. And those timbers, and you can see the size of these timbers, the outer timbers on the Globe are 30, 35 feet long, enormously heavy, solid oak, foot square. And these were dragged away from the site. They must have had, I mean, it must have been very well organised, because they must have either had trained oxen or horses to drag them away from the site. And those timbers were taken over to the south bank. It was always, the story is always they were taken over when the Thames was frozen, but I think that's a good story. They were probably, they were taken over, and the Globe Theatre was built from those timbers. So what was the theatre, Shakespeare's home, then became the Globe Theatre on the south bank. There it is, you can see it over there. And the interesting thing is, just around this time, Shakespeare leaves St Helens. Now, I won't get into this in great detail, but because I can't prove it, but, and this will probably disappoint the Southwark Tourist Board, but I strongly suspect that Shakespeare never actually went to live in Southwark. He was living in a very upmarket area, and in 1602, or 1604, it's not quite clear where, he's moved here just by the Museum of London. The Museum of London's here, those who know the city, to this house of a French Huguenot maker of head ties. Head ties were those things that women put in their hair to sort of put big hair over them. So he was lodging there, and quite why he's living there is not clear. Mr. Mountjoy, who was his landlord, was a not particularly nice person. And the reason that we know Shakespeare lived there was subsequently a court case, because Mountjoy's apprentice married his daughter. Mountjoy offered him lots of dowry, and then he refused to pay it. And eventually, the son got so fed up that he took him to court. And in the National Archive, there is a deposition by Shakespeare about this, which is probably the only direct speech recorded. It wouldn't have been written down by Shakespeare, written down by a clerk, but it's probably the only actual piece we have of Shakespeare sort of talking. And I suspect he lived there because being in the theatre business, you had ready money all the time. It's a bit like being a car salesman, you know, it's always cash, you know, it's a kind of cash economy, because, you know, the money came in and then it's given out to the actors at the end of the day. So I suspect Shakespeare was always being stopped for loans and things, and having a rather grumpy guy on the front door probably looked after him. But the other interesting thing about the area is that when the Globe was built over here, the Rose Theatre, the one that was discovered in the 1980s, where the Lord Admiral's men were based, moved. So that company moved north of the river, and they built the Fortune Theatre here. So in fact, being just over here, inside the bend of the city wall, again, quite a quiet area, quite a wealthy upmarket another wealthy upmarket parish, Shakespeare could have slipped out to spy on what the competition was up to, or he could have passed down here and got a wherry over to the Globe. At that point, I'm going to finish. That's the end of Shakespeare in St Helens. Thanks for listening. I'm run too much over time. I hope it's given you a bit of a feeling that although it doesn't tell us directly anything about Shakespeare, I think by seeing that he could have lived anywhere in any of the 100 parishes in the city of London, he chose, and I think it was a choice, to live in an upmarket, affluent parish, lots of ambitious people, lots of international merchants, lots of money being made. You know, he wasn't hiding away out of sight, a bit like Christopher Marlowe up the road outside the city in Norton Folgate. He was choosing to be at the heart of things, and as I said, it was the period when he was re-establishing his family's reputation, investing in Stratford. Several of these doctors and people, you know, they had country estates. Shakespeare never had a country estate in the sense of something that didn't generate money. He bought land in Stratford to create an income, but he was clearly keen to show off his reputation by going back to his home town and buying a big house and all the rest of it. And I think there is a sort of final point, Chris. There is a sort of fundamental difference, because the great tragedies, starting with Hamlet and then Macbeth and King Lear and Othello, are not from this period. This is the period of we mentioned Romeo and Juliet, the Merchant of Venice, and so on and so forth. It's the move to the Globe opening in 1599, which probably had a much bigger audience, which kicked off another phase in his writing career. Whether that was because of things that he heard and thought about in St Helens is difficult to say, but if you want to buy the book, there's a bit in there about it as well. So thank you very much.
Is this on? Yes. I am conscious of we had some audio problems on the chat. What I'm going to suggest is that any questions that are asked in the room, that Geoffrey repeats them and then answers them. So rather than me going up and down and sharing, I will share from here. But ultimately, Geoffrey doing most of the talking. I'm also going to let people online gather their thoughts if they will have typed their questions in the chat. So I will ask whether we have any questions from the audience in the room.
Just a really simple aside, you talk about the current, present massive 35 book. What makes you think that the Shakespeare's going to do anything about it?
The question is about whether the reconstruction of the globe as you can go visit it on the South Bank today is exactly the same as the original globe. Yeah, is that correct? Yeah. Well, it's there's a lot of arguments about it. It's pretty close. I mean, the foundations for the theatre show that these were massive timbers. They were put on dwarf brick walls so they didn't get damp. But the scale of it was, it may have been a bit smaller than the reconstructions that's there now, but it was pretty similar. I think the thing to realise is that each of those main timbers is one tree. To get a timber that big, you have to cut one tree down. And this, of course, is why, the great oak forests of the Weald disappeared very rapidly, because particularly shipbuilding. And so it's interesting that the timbers of the theatre, which by that time was 21 years old, were thought so valuable that they just, in the original lease in 1576, it said they could actually remove the building, and so they did. I'm not sure they took every timber from it, but what I think they were after were those big timbers, which would otherwise cost a great deal. And the other thing, these, you couldn't just sort of walk out of London and cut these things down because they disappeared years ago. I mean, these timbers came from a long way away, cutting trees down, sawing them was a huge job. So the reuse of timbers made perfect sense. But to answer your question, it's probably pretty similar. And of course, the thing is that nowadays, because of health and safety, numbers are kind of controlled, but to an extent. But these things, if lots of people turn up, they pack them in.
There was a question on the chat actually about Jon Spencer, and could you say a little bit about why he was in prison?
Well, yes, he was put in prison for abusing his daughter, which might have been shouting at her or indeed hitting her. I mean, he doesn't say, but it was. This was 4 years after he was Lord Mayor, so this is a pretty extraordinary thing to do, and also. Jon Spencer was not someone you wanted to, get the wrong side of. I mean, someone who became the consul in Aleppo in Syria, trading, records that he was got thrown out of his job by the machinations of Jon Spencer, who got someone else in. In fact, who lived here as well. So he wasn't a person to get to the wrong side. And in fact, his daughter was sent into the protection of a leading alderman in the city. So it was clearly sort of pretty serious. Yeah. Mm. Sorry. Yeah. Well, sadly, virtually nothing. So the question was what's left of the nunnery. The church is left, so that's there, so you can walk around it. But all the rest of it was destroyed in the 18th century. Because the Leather Cellars owned the site, they rebuilt it completely in 1799. And in fact, part of it's just been rebuilt. And they've got a lovely new livery hall there. And although I'm normally in favour of archives, being in archive offices, they have their original archives on the site where they were written, which is rather nice. And they've been there, since 1540s. So, and they've got, because they have now got office buildings there and rent it out to commercial companies, they have their leases running from the 1550s up to the present day. You can see it. So if any of you ever want a great study to do, someone could do an amazing study of the evolution of the parish, because of course, in a sense, it reflects the story of the City of London. And some of you may have seen, I think it was last week, that Barbados had decided to separate, no longer have the Queen as head of government. And it's interesting because Barbados, I think, was occupied by the English in the 1625 or 27. And the inner courtyard of the nunnery, the inner courtyard, sorry, I'll just show on here, which probably when Peter Turner, he probably grew medicinal plants and things there, quite likely, was leased in 1629 to a sugar boiler. And it's really interesting because the sugar would have come from the West Indies. Half it would have been put into barrels. It had been boiled and half treated. There was sugar refining elsewhere in the city, but it's extraordinary that the Leather Cellars don't seem to be at all bothered by having a huge source of fire next to their hall. The only thing they wrote in was it said the sugar boiling works shouldn't stop the light up into their hall. They were more worried about light than fire. And in fact, down here, certainly in the 18th century, was the Sugarloaf Public House. I don't know if that went back to them. So this was the sort of economy of the city sort of pivoting at that period. Now, Shakespeare died when he was quite young. He died when he was 52. If he lived to probably, like Ben Jonson's age, he'd have seen all this. And really what was happening here is you've got the heart of the City of London changing to a sort of proto-capitalist economy. And the key thing is that John Spencer was one of the key people involved in the founding of the East India Company at the end of 1600. In fact, after he died, and a few other people have been in it, this building became the headquarters of the East India Company. And in fact, the cellars of the Leather Cellars Hall were let out for storing stuff coming back. And so the start of this extraordinary story of what became arguably the largest commercial business ever in the world, started in this area and in the surrounding streets. So it's a sort of curious patch of London.
To follow on from that, and that's a question that's come up in the chat from Stuart, and this is, I'm going to broaden it slightly. He was asking particularly about Shakespeare's social status and the extent to which, as you demonstrated, you've got some very rich people, early capitalists, alongside people who are less wealthy. And he asked about what you think maybe Shakespeare would Shakespeare have been able to mix with this crowd, or would he be seen as an upstart? And I wonder whether you might use that as a way of thinking about the kind of diversity of the neighbourhood.
Yeah, well, that's a very good question, Stuart. It's a very good question. Of course, part of the problem of looking at records is, by their nature, they tend to record rich people, and also they tend to record men rather than women, because that's just how records are structured. And in the book, I have tried to look at it a bit more broadly than that. And alongside these rich people, there were leather workers and metal workers and just grocers and sort of people you'd have found in every parish in the city of London. I think what is difficult to work through in detail is probably how hard Shakespeare worked. Got to remember that when he was working at the theatre, probably in the morning they'd be rehearsing a new play, and then they'd have to get ready for the afternoon, and then they'd have to perform a play. And it wasn't every day of the year, but it was a large chunk of the year. So Shakespeare was writing 2 plays a year at this time. That's about 4,000 lines. And when did he write it? So I suspect that part of what appealed to him about this area was that, you know, once he got home, his family, we don't know whether his family came to London, but the assumption is usually that they stayed in Stratford, is he could get into his rooms, his lodgings, shut the door and actually work. And I think, you know, he was, astonishingly hard-working. And it's interesting because these properties here were what were the steward's lodgings of the nunnery. So before the nunnery was got rid of, you'd have come in here and paid your money and all this sort of thing. And in the leases, which still survive, one of them is described as being divided and severed, the building, which suggests it's been split up into sort of rooms of some description. And although it's quite possible that he came through here, this was actually the medieval gate of the nunnery. So it was probably had doors. Well, it's known it had doors on it because it was record of being repaired. So this area here, you would not have been able to drive carts through because it was only pedestrian access. So it would have been very, relatively quiet compared with Bishopsgate, which would be very noisy. And actually, this part of the actual Leather Cellar's estate was, I suppose, in what you call modern terminology, a semi-gated estate. There was a gate here which prevented you getting round to the livery hall unless you had business, but there was actually a gate over here onto the street. It's not quite how you imagine our national poet, but he was possibly chose to be here because it was a place where he could sort of get away from the hurly-burly of the rest and get on and do some work. So that's why I'm very clear. We've got absolutely no evidence, or very little evidence, that Shakespeare ever spoke to anybody. I like to think I speak to my neighbours occasionally in the street, but sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. But it is interesting because I do think there's quite a few things. I mentioned one of them of events that went around the area, which do feed through into his writings. And one rather nice one, although again you can't prove it, is down in the bottom left-hand corner. The next parish here is St Martin's, and it was known, there was a well here, actually in the middle of the road, and it was known as St Martin's by the well with 2 buckets. So those of you who know your Richard II, so these were wells where as one bucket went up, the other went down. I don't know if you know Richard II, but he describes how as one fortune goes up, his bucket is going down and full of tears. Now, it could be any well, I guess, but it is kind of interesting that he was actually virtually next door to something that was called that. Probably the most extraordinary thing, and it's very complicated, so I'm afraid to have to read the book if you're interested, is that there was a guy living probably in this row of houses here called Robert Honeywood. And Robert Honeywood relatives owned the site outside Canterbury where the person drowned, who is the basis, the court case was the basis of whether Ophelia was drowned herself and committed suicide, or whether, so to speak, the river drowned her. It was a real court case. It was published, so it was presumably known about. But Robert Honeywood lived here. His sister was actually married to the person who owned the estate outside Canterbury, where the person committed suicide, which is the basis of the court case. And it's such an extraordinary coincidence that I rather suspect there must be some connection there.
there any other literary?
Well, interestingly enough, I wouldn't quite describe the literary figures, but there were two very interesting people in the next parish. Robert Armin, who you may or may not know, he was the comedian of the Lord Chamberlain's men. After 1600, after Kemp left, he took over, and Armin was living in this parish in the 1590s. Or Robert Armin is recorded. Whether it is the Robert Armin is not absolutely certain, but it's the only one there is in the City of London. And living in very, looks like he was living in probably in a one-room accommodation. Perhaps more extraordinary is the Bull Inn. So just down here, there was a guy there living there called John Wells. This is not the John Wells which bought the manor of Stratford-on-Avon. Very confusing, the two John Wells. John Wells was actually the Queen's messenger. So this was the person who would take letters written by Queen Elizabeth onto the continent. That was his job. There were a couple of them, but he was the leading one. And so all through the 1580s and 1590s, there was a person living literally on the other side of the road to where Shakespeare was living in the 1590s, who travelled all across Europe and would have gone to the court of the French king, and was actually arrested in France, in Rouen, in 1589, and was kept in prison for a year and a half. He claimed he was a spy, and was eventually freed by a prisoner swap. So he had come back. He petitioned the Privy Council to sort of compensate him for this terrible time he had. He wrote these really sad letters to the Privy Council saying, look after my family, and I'm going to die here, and all this sort of stuff. And basically, they said, well, we can't really do anything, but anything you can grab off these people, because the events had changed in France, you can. And he clearly made a lot of money, because he then tried to marry, his daughter off to a sort of semi-aristocrat who was slightly appalled by this idea. So round about the time Shakespeare here was this person, and I've always thought it's kind of interesting, because in Henry V you've got the great scene with the messenger, the royal messengers, turning up with the tennis balls, which of course weren't Wimbledon tennis balls. They were hard, real tennis balls, and whether he'd been over the road to the Bull Inn and had a chat with John, because John Wells's wife's brother actually owned the Bull Theatre. So it's a sort of it's an interesting story. So although he wasn't John Wells wasn't a performer as such, he could write a good Latin hand and was highly educated, and probably lived around here because there was so many. This was an area with lots and lots of horses. Horses were really, really expensive things. It's like keeping a kind of Ferrari in the City of London. Put it in context, the vicar of St Helens was paid about £20 a year, which was considered not really enough to sort of keep your appearances up. They usually said you needed about £30. To keep a horse in the City of London for a fortnight was 7 shillings and 6pence. So for those of you who can remember pre-decimal, or those who can't, that's about a third of a pound. So most people, unless you were super rich, couldn't afford to have horses. So these inns would have had horses almost like livery stables, which is probably why he was based there, because if you got a debt, just jump on a horse and off you go. So it's a sort of, it's quite interesting that Shakespeare's just over the boundary in sort of very wealthy parish, and the one just to the north is a bit like living next to, I don't know, Waterloo Station, or I don't know, sort of equivalent today.
The organisation of the theatre. I mean, did they have somebody responsible for promoting, somebody for the building of the stage, props and things?
Well, the theatre itself was a permanent structure. So, but there was a core group of actors, and then it's known from records that there were assistants and all the rest of it. The theatre had it's all in the book if you want, had a very it's been written about quite a lot. It was built by Burbage with his brother-in-law, and they fell out over it big time. It went over budget, like most building things do, and they were arguing in the courts all through its history. There's far more known about it from these court cases than from anywhere else. And in fact, after the main protagonists had died, the next generation down continued to go through the courts, suing each other over the ownership. And there's these records of the different halves of it, sort of turning up at the door and claiming the rights to take the money, the gatherers, as they were called, the people who actually took the money of people. But it's interesting because the costumes were valuable. There wouldn't have been much in the way of sets, in fact, but costumes would have been, they're often mentioned in wills or in records of things being sold. But the main thing was the value of the building. That was what was worth the money, and that's why when they left and went to Southwark, they took the building with them. And of course, not so much in Bath because you've got it's mostly stone, but obviously medieval buildings were pegged together, with wood, and were often assembled off-site first and then brought on-site. They're sort of prefabricated. So taking a building apart wasn't as difficult as it probably sounds. But in the records, it rather sounds like it was taken down in a couple of days. And if you talk to most specialist craftsmen who work on repairing timber structures, they say there's no way this building could have been taken down in a day or two because just the size of the timbers. And the need for trained either oxen probably to drag these things to wherever they were kept. So it's there are records of props and all the rest of it, which presumably had to be made or borrowed or whatever.
Stuart on the chat has asked another question, which I know is quite a contentious one amongst early modern theatre stories, which is around the closing of theatres during Baycott. And you just want to know, was it because of government decree or were they shut down for practical reasons?
Well, it's a good question. Kind of strangely sort of resonant at the moment. They were shut down, and not just in this country. I mean, there's in other places in Europe, they were shut down, and really because they were the main, apart from churches, which obviously there's a religious function, they were the main gathering places where you got lots and lots of people together. So it was one of the very, very few things that the administration could actually do practically to stop the spread of plague. It's interesting, actually. In 1594, Francis Bacon's brother, was his cousin, can't remember. Sorry, moved into Bishopsgate Street, and he got his mother was a bit of a finger-wagging mother, and she wrote in this letter, which still survives, saying, "I can't believe that you've moved in next to the Bull Theatre, which will, if it doesn't corrupt you, will corrupt all your servants." And she says, she was living up in Hertfordshire, and it says, and I've been talking to a sort of man of the cloth, and he says the minister is, it's a very poor parish, and the minister doesn't know what he's talking about, sort of thing. And then it says, and it's quite interesting. She said, and although it's a very wide road, in other words, it had lots of ventilation. There were lots of people that died there during the plague in 1593, and this is quite interesting because they clearly at some level recognised that crowded, what we call them now, multi-generational accommodation, was where plague spread. And you had to be a bit careful about this because it was sort of typical of the period that the major concentration of deaths were in the suburbs, and particularly St Botolph's, which is the parish up here. And St Botolph's is usually sort of painted as this kind of slum. But in fact, any of you who've been in the V&A will know that there's the front of Paul Pinder's house is preserved in the V&A. Paul Pinder was the English consul to the Ottoman court. So he was a very wealthy, very powerful merchant. And he built his house on Bishopsgate in the middle of St Botolph's in 1599. So he clearly was happy enough with it as a sort of upmarket area to build this fabulous house. I think what had happened was that as you saw right at the start, there were lots of sort of fields with sort of alleyways. And what tended to happen was that they built out the backlands, and that's where these packed tenements were located. And they all have rather romantic names like kind of Three Squirrel Alley or Nutmeg Court, or all these sort of things. But I think that's where the disease spread, just because there was so many people packed together into them. But as I said, one of the interesting things about this is that it's been recognised that for years that there was massive variations between the different parishes. So there were over 100 in the City of London. So the parish of St Helens was about the size of Trafalgar Square, and that was quite a big parish. So that, these were tiny areas, and so it's known. You can, quite a lot of work was done on this about differential death rates, which I think is going to, people going to get interested again, given how varied death rates from COVID sadly are across the country today.
I have one very quick. I'll do the long version and then the very short one.
Yeah.
The long one is that one thing that we often forget about London in this period is that it is, in large part, quite a migrant city. Unlike on the continent, where you have dynasties, families, governments, and generations of people in the same place, London has an enormous church of people coming in, particularly from elsewhere. So Shakespeare coming in is just another, is typical in that respect. And so one of the questions I'd ask, which is a fun question, but have you been able to find anybody else in his parish who was local to Stratford?
No. But I mean, it's, so I think there's three things. The first thing is, we slightly have this sort of view, that families, lived centuries in the same street, in this sort of period. In fact, although you get, with some families, 2 or 3 generations, and you can occasionally trace people getting married, if you take 50 years, there's, apart, virtually nobody is still there. And part of the reason for that is almost all the property was rented. And so you could basically, people didn't have very much furniture, so your accommodation could, upsize or downsize, as we say nowadays, very easily, according to what your family needs were. And the other thing is that most of the leases ran, all ran to the Feast of St Michael in the autumn. So you sort of knew that, if you were moving there, there'd be other people moving, presumably there'd be slightly sort of musical chairs. So it's very difficult to track down where people come from at all, to be honest. Just to give you one example, this big place here, this giant thing, is the house of Thomas Gresham. So Thomas Gresham, there's just a book come out about him. He basically handled England's national debt in the 1550s and 1560s, made huge amounts of money, and built the Royal Exchange in London, that's a commercial centre. And then he took over, these were some older buildings here, and he built this courtyard. And the interesting thing is that he was originally going to leave his money to Cambridge University. So there are only 2 universities, Cambridge and Oxford. And so he's going to leave his money to Cambridge. But he actually decided to set up what was going to be London's first institute of higher education. And it's interesting because you can see it's very similar to an Oxford college. It was a courtyard. In fact, this wing here had almshouses in it. And so he did that. And when he died in 1579, so he only lived there for about 15 years, he said that it should become an institute of higher education, going to be called Gresham College, but only when his widow had died. And his widow, who was a pretty tough cookie in many ways, but was getting on by that time, survived until 1596. So for 17 years, basically she and her extremely unpleasant son lived in this huge building, I mean, you can see how big it is. It's big as a nunnery. And talking about, people moving into the area, you kind of think, well, people, there were 7 professorships which paid £50 a year for giving basically a sort of, lecture every so often. It was, and so I suspect quite a lot of people just moved into the area. Could be quite a nice little number, but every year went by and she refused to die. Oh, and why should she have done? But to give you some idea, John Bull, who's I think one of the professor of music, he had to employ a gang of masons to evict her son from his rooms because he refused to move out. So it's obviously these sort of battles going on at the end. You asked for a little upbeat story right at the end, so I'll just tell you a little story. This is the next, just to end on a rather nice story. This is the parish church of St Ethelburga. So this was immediately north. So this was the parish of, and this was this poor parish full of these travellers' inns and all the rest of it. The parish was so poor, they were constantly trying to think of ways of making money. And so they actually built a shop in front of the front door of the church. I'm not making this up. And in fact, part of it survived till the 1930s. It's in the Museum of London. As a way of generating income. And they used to rent the church out during the week as a school, so the records of the income from it. But the rather nice thing is, in the 1590s, in this, it's called the Little Shop by the church door. So I mean, it was probably, at this sort of size. It was rented by someone called Samuel Aylward, and he was a glover. And so it's rather nice thought that as, and of course, we can't sort of prove this, but as Shakespeare walked up to work every day, he'd have passed a glove shop. And funnily enough, when it was pulled down in the 1930s for road widening, it was still a sort of gentleman's shop. It sold razor blades, knickknacks, and sort of gentleman's accessories, which I'm sure is what he was doing. I mean, I don't think it was just a glove maker's shop. I mean, in fact, prior to that, it was owned by a purse maker. But it was obviously sort of knickknacks and sort of leather goods and all that sort of stuff. So I thought it was really a rather nice place to end this. I know this is more Shakespeare in love than academic history, but it's in the parish records. So just imagine Shakespeare walking out, heading up to the theatre, and thinking, "God, thank God I escaped from Stratford." Didn't say that. Thanks very much. If anybody wants a copy of the book, I'm not sure what 30% off it is, but I have some at £15 if anybody wants. I've got a couple of copies if anybody wants to take one away, but I won't feel. Oh, right, okay. Oh.
Yeah. Just before we wrap up, just to say thank you so much to Geoffrey for a wonderfully evocative, the dirt of your fingernails in that study of a neighbourhood in London in the 1590s. So a wonderful Helen talk. So thank you very much. Just to say that the Literature of Humanities group will not meet in January, but we will be meeting on Valentine's Day, where you can judge whether it is apposite or irony or something else. We will have Ellis Naylor speaking about bar planning campaigns. So please look out for that. But otherwise, just please join me in thanking Geoffrey, and thank you to everybody online.
Thank you.
Good night.
Can I just say one thing? If any of you are interested in women's health, and looking at the audience, I suspect some of you are, and you want to take on a piece of research connected to Bath, but not like a PhD level, I think there's a great, let's call it a pamphlet, to be written about Edward Jorden, because he was an extraordinary guy, and although he's been mentioned by quite a lot of people because of his work in the Mary Glover trial, I think you've got to remember, this is before Harvey had actually announced, everybody's working on the idea that blood circulated around the heart, but, it was before people kind of accepted it. And even when Harvey actually, published his book, there was a famous quote, I'd prefer to err with Galen than tell the truth with Harvey, or whatever the quote was. I can't quite remember. It shows you how, be careful, but, doctors were very, very traditional. And I think Edward Jorden was quite a remarkable, really remarkable person. There's a lot more to be found out about him. And in fact, I was looking just in your library, and it actually, in a book that I saw, it actually identified where Edward Jorden lived in Bath, which was in West Street, opposite the Baths. The only trouble is that Edward Jorden had a cousin also called Edward Jorden. Very confusing. So which one it was, I don't know. But if any of you are feeling, that you want to do some research and write something, I think it's a great little book. And I think the issues he was dealing with about how can we call it? The medical professions dealing with women are extremely apposite in the current time. And I'm sure there's lots of interesting parallels you could find. And as I said, you've got his book on spas here, so you've got no excuse for not reading it, and it's online anyway. That one's quite difficult to find, but the 1603 one is quite. He's just put it in, and I can't. It's the University of Michigan that does all those history online. The University of Michigan, it's all in there, if you particularly want to look into the Mary Glover affair, there's a site called Brimstone, which I thought was a sort of, like a sort of Rosemary's Baby sort of site, but it's not. It's actually one of the worst titled academic research sites I think I've ever come across, which is from an English point of view, studying the language that was used over bewitchment. So it's a sort of ultimate English language study. But as a result of that, they record every reference in this trial to every person and every phrase they use. So if you want, and that's on your computer. So some of the raw material is pretty easy to get at. Thanks.